anyone who's been following identity politics over the last few years is likely aware of the connections between progressive activism and far-left ideologues. It's gotten to the point where the two terms have become synonymous with each other. But despite this, there are still those who have doubts as to whether such a link even exists. For example, a common talking point amongst the gender-critical movement is that they believe trans activism is a form of conservative ideology and therefore pushed by the right wing. Of course, taking a look at your run-of-the-mill trans activist or gender radical or whatever term you wish to ascribe to them, you'll clearly see that's not the case. And just the other day, I came across an article that highlights exactly how these movements work. I want to introduce you to Laura Isaguire. In her own words, "I'm a cisgender, neurodivergent queer Latinx trying to find her authentic self. I'm all about supporting others who are on the same journey. I am sex positive and kink positive. Trans women are women, sex work is work, and fascism is a real and omnipresent threat. I am new to the political commentary scene and I still have a lot to learn, but I do my best to propel what is right forward in my writing. My main focuses are on queer topics related to the LGBTQ community, social justice and exposing. I am apparently infamous among TERF circles for scaring the shit out of them. Good. All fascists should be afraid all the time." Now, a little about Isaguire from what I've been able to gather. She used to have an account on Medium which was banned after the website received a string of complaints from the gender critical crowd. Looking on the Wayback Machine, I've been able to find at least the titles of a number of her articles. Transphobic fear-mongering under the guise of rape relief. This is one of the only articles actually archived where she compares a rape crisis centre to a neo-Nazi indoctrination camp. Landlords are in need of guillotines, parroting the rhetoric of Chairman Mao. And the strangest of all, no more registries, no more fear. Someone was able to capture a screenshot of the first paragraph, at least in all its warped glory. "It's time to stop tolerating a system rife with corruption, racial bias and abuse. Why should we allow myths about public safety, fearing our neighbourhoods and fictional boogeymen to dominate discourse? Why should an institution beloved by bigots and championed by the alt-right be allowed to persist? We need to abolish one of the most loathsome tools of mass incarceration, the sex offender registry." Now, initially when I stumbled upon this person, I did believe it was actually a troll account, but she does appear to have a personal Facebook page where she calls for landlords to lose her heads, called for students to beat up a teacher just for the crime of misgendering, and also engaged in doxing. The page is also littered with radical communist propaganda, which at this point should come as no surprise. So why am I highlighting all of this? I mean, after all, Isaguire isn't exactly a big name in the trans activist world, far from it, although one of her articles was shared by a blue-tick editor of US Weekly, which at least highlights there are those in positions of influence who are willing to listen to her and parrot her beliefs. But the article, which appeared to be the one to get her yeeted from Medium, "Resisting TERFs and Transforming Their Organisations," reads almost like a trans activist manifesto, and all the points raised have real-world examples, so it works as a viewing hole to see how this movement operates. Let's go through this report together to gain a better understanding of radical gender activists. So the first point highlighted is parallel institutions. According to the article, a solid first step is to create organisations that are inclusive to all, that are redundant with whatever function the TERFs run. Sometimes it's enough to simply beat the TERFs at their own game. People like less discrimination, not more. Our trend as a society is towards greater understanding of one another. For this to happen, you have to provide a viable alternative to whatever function the TERFs are currently offering, so people can choose to avoid them. Now, I don't have much of a problem with someone making their own institutions as their own little echo chamber. They should absolutely have the freedom to do that, but these organisations that stand on their own aren't always the ones who historically gain success. After all, the appeal of a radical socialist startup is only going to have a limited attraction. Normies are generally scared off by radical politics regardless of where it ends up on the spectrum. But the second point is where we start to recognisably see trans activist playbook in action. Leadership reform, basically the infiltration of already established groups, organisations and parties, and the replacement of the leadership in favour of those who ideologically suit you. This has an actual name, entryism, and it is regularly associated with Leon Trotsky. In his book, An Outsider's Guide to Antifa, the author Matthew Knuth writes, one key strategy advocated by Trotsky that continues to be utilised is the practice of entryism. Entryism involves masquerading as a member of a mainstream left party, typically one that is social democratic in nature, in order to advance a militant socialist agenda. Knuth highlights claims that both Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders benefited from such a tactic. Now, in the author's words, with TERF groups, many will likely try to ban trans women from membership. This can be worked around. Cis women allies can easily enter a given organisation. If they work as a collective, it's a matter of figuring out the number needed to achieve a simple majority. For example, if a collective has about 25 members, then a group as small as 30 could wrest control from the bigots. Then, when it comes time to select leaders, remove the old bigoted guard and instill rational leadership. Done correctly, this is a wonderful bloodless democratic coup. It's enabled since TERFs are a tiny, if loud, minority of all women. Finding women willing to help replace their hate with love and inclusiveness is therefore not an impossible task. Now, Isaguire actually uses two real-world examples of this tactic, that of Marvel Comics, which has undoubtedly become more social justice-oriented than ever before, and the recent Netflix revamp of She-Ra, highlighting how these would not be possible were it not for the editorial shift as a result of entryism. This may seem unimportant, but they highlight how culturally significant institutions, Marvel in particular, can be easily swayed to being on their side. Now, as a side note, another example of trans activist entryism could arguably be found in Stonewall, who took on trans issues as their leading policy around 2015. In Stonewall's case, the entryism was mutually beneficial, but that's a story for another video. Isaguire then goes on to talk about targeting the finance of groups the radicals are unable to infiltrate. Now, this is a tactic we see from the radical left on a daily basis, but if you want a recent example, you can look at the advertisers of Mumsnet, who have been regularly targeted by gender activists and have received a varied level of success. Of course, Isaguire has to mention the Vancouver Rape Relief Centre, labelling Morgan Auger as a hero for helping to defund a centre designed to protect vulnerable women. Like, whatever way this is spun, the optics are never going to look good for those who aren't already in the cult. But where the article gets really interesting, however, is the advocacy of direct action. This involves, according to the writer, deplatforming events, removing people from social media, doxing, and even acts of vandalism. I've extensively covered examples of each of these on my channel: gender-critical groups having meetings shut down, Meghan Murphy being banned from Twitter by Jessica Yaniv, the Vancouver Rape Relief Centre having a dead rat nailed to it. To list all these would take up too much time, but they fall directly out of an Antifa playbook. The website It's Going Down, which has ironically since been taken down, has a working manifesto for Antifa groups, and you can find examples of all the above. Doxing, graffiti, shutting down events, these and more can be found here, and considering the article we're discussing was written by an avowed radical left-winger, the link here should be obvious. But the last tactic being discussed, the grand finale if you will, is probably the one that will really wake you up. Physical violence. According to the author, what about bodily harm against bigots? Is that a valid tactic? Yes, but within important considerations. It's the most serious form of corrective action you can use, and one very likely to get you in major trouble. Only use it as a tactic if you're sure you can handle the consequence of being caught. Now, predictably, the example of an Antifa activist punching white nationalist Richard Spencer in the face a few years ago is the first thing mentioned, but in the same paragraph, the author says this: similarly, there was a heroic trans woman who almost delivered a heroic blow for justice against TERF Julie Bindel. The writer subliminally compares Bindel to Spencer, an obscene comparison to make. And of course, Bindel isn't the only example of a radical feminist who has been assaulted, or at least been attempted to be assaulted. Tara Wolfe certainly springs to mind, as she was thoroughly commended by trans activists in positions of power, such as then NUS officer Jess Bradley. Now, to the author's credit, she stopped short of calling to kill her political opponents. But this article was originally published on Medium, where even calling for violence as grounds for a banning. Considering her aforementioned rhetoric against landlords, who she's repeatedly said need the guillotine, and the reference to Chairman Mao, who famously had landlords killed when communists seized power in China, I'm not sure whether this is a genuine call for de-escalation, or just the author hiding a power level. As I mentioned earlier, the author of this piece isn't a big name activist, although there's no doubt she'd certainly like to be. But the reason for this discussion is that this article is a fascinating insight into the working of a gender radical, the tactics they use being those of the extreme left, and even if nobody has heard of Laura Isaguire, gender radicals, along with intersectional and left-wing comrades around the world, are familiar with the way she thinks.